Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting momentarily. I think we're now live and it's on YouTube and it's being recorded. Let's start. My name is Marvin Rappaport. I am delighted to be joined by three colleagues, neighbors from the Borscht Belt, and to talk to you tonight about Tales from the Borscht Belt. I am on the library board of the Ethelbert B. Crawford Public Library in Monticello. And I'll just put in a plug. We do periodic reports on the time gone by in the Borscht Belt. This is one in a series. We recently did one on Tales from the Dining Room, which we were thrilled to have almost 100 people on the call, but we had over 1,000 views on YouTube, so somebody's interested in the Borscht Belt. And I hope that this conversation tonight likewise gets a good exposure. There's also about 30 interviews that I and some other friends and colleagues did with people like those who are going to join us tonight on what it was like working, playing, and growing up in the Catskills and being part of the Borscht Belt experience. Tonight, we're talking about the owner's experience. Last time we talked about the dining room and the craziness and the carryings on. For those of you who think that being in the owner's family is a wonderful thing and it was such a treat, we may disabuse you of that notion tonight as we proceed. It was special. We'll talk about it. I want to introduce the panelists, and I'll do it in the order that they're going to speak. Mark Kutcher, many of you know, it is here. It says Mark's iPad. Mark grew up at the hotel. He and I were classmates with Sandy Asman, who I'll introduce in a moment, in Monticello. Kutcher's, for those who don't know, is in Monticello, out either the Anawanna Lake Road or the Old Liberty Road, right in between, or at least it was for more than 100 years, and Mark will talk about that. Patti Posner is from the Brickman, the Hotel Brickman over in Fallsburg, near the Tarry Bray Golf Course and the Fallsburg High School, and she'll talk about her experiences there. And Sandy Asman, whose mom and aunt owned, managed, and operated the Esther Manor, one of the few hotels, 2 women in charge, at a crazy place like the Catskills, and he'll talk to us about what that was like. And if you noticed, when I sent out the notice, we said we're going to talk about catering to guests from the various hotels. Oh, my family owned the Delano Hotel. My grandfather, Abe Schecht, Monticello, out the Old Liberty Road. And if time permits, I'll talk a little bit about that. I talked about catering to the guests. In some cases, thousands, but certainly hundreds of guests. But I also said in the phrase, putting up with the guests. It was very special that we had a treat, some of whom came for 8 weeks. Can you imagine serving Mrs. Schwartz 3 meals a day, 7 days a week for 8 weeks? Try it sometime. It's not fun. Let's start with Mark. A couple of questions to think about. How did your family get into the hotel business? Which family members, if you can tick off a few that worked in the business? And what was it like growing up at your hotel and maybe some of the jobs you had? And Mark, why don't you kick it off for us?
I will give it a go. There's a lot of years there that we're going to cover. Our hotel was one of the earliest hotels in the Catskills. My family bought the property, which is in the town of Thompson, in 1906. And we remained in the hotel business for 107 years. And it was really 3 generations of us, but it was my grandparents, Louis and Fanny Kutcher, and my great uncle and aunt, Max and Rebecca Kutcher, who started the hotel. My father, Milton, and his brother Joe were really born in Monticello, even though the family went to New York City to give birth to them, but they were Monticelloites from the very beginning. They went to school in a one-room schoolhouse near the hotel off of the Old Liberty Road. And then used to, when they had finally got into regular school, half the time we're walking into town from, 3.5 miles or so. Anyway, so so they were, I'm going to try to truncate it because it's a very convoluted history of my family. So I'm going to fast forward. We were a sleepy kind of hotel until after World War II. My grandmother Rebecca really had the place after the passing of my great uncle at an early age. And she kept it alive. She kept it alive through World War I, the pandemic, the Great Depression, World War II. At the end of World War II, which most of my cousins and my father and uncles from that era were all involved in, my father came back at the end of 45. My mother, who was in the hotel business also, because she was adopted by Rebecca Kutcher. She, along with her brother Joe Wasser, were there, and my father and mother kind of rediscovered each other, and so you set the scene in 1946, and my father comes back and he rediscovers the hotel that he hadn't been in for many, many years as an operating person, because my grandfather, Louis, had left it in the late 20s. And they get married. And one of the first things they did, because they were living that first year above the kitchen and that you get up to from the children's dining room, they had to build a house out there to take care of Rebecca and them and me, who was the baby coming along the next year. So I grew up living in two places. When the season was on, we had our home at the hotel, and in the off season, which ran from going backwards from the end of October till the week before Passover, we lived in Monticello. And that went on till my senior year in high school, when we opened year round. However, in between time, as I was growing up, the early years were probably different than most people would think was normal. But for us children, and probably the other three panelists, what we did, because as kids you didn't know any better, was really normal. And my early years were really quite idyllic in many ways. We had a hotel that was growing rapidly. My father and mother really together really lit up what was a sleepy hotel, and started to move up the ranks of hotels in rapid order. And they're, like every hotel, these hotels are a reflection of what the people who own them are interested in and how they want to represent the kind of hotel they want. For my parents, with children, with me, my two sisters who came after me, really focused on family and sports. Those were the two things that really separate us from some of the other hotels. But it was an active time as a kid. We had a terrific, trying to be a family hotel, they had developed a terrific day camp, and a teen program followed that. So as a kid, I spent a lot of the time in day camp, and kind of augmented it with other things. The day camp was great because it wasn't like in those years and through the 50s, it wasn't people rolling in and out every 2 or 3 days. People stayed usually for a minimum of a week. Many families, as Marvin mentioned, stayed for the whole season. And you also had the staff of the hotel, and in our hotel, it wasn't true in every hotel, the staff families were a part of what was happening. So the kids of the band leader or the director of activities, and I can go on through a lot of different people, their children also participated in what was happening in the hotel. So you had a standing population of people who we'd see every summer. The spring and the fall was a little different. But so during that period, as a kid, young kid growing up, if it was summertime, we ate in the children's dining room. We functioned as part of the camp. I mean, we grew up as kids. I early on loved horses, and we had a riding stable, and I got pretty adept at an early age, and I'd spend a lot of extra time riding. At the age of 8, my father had built a driving range, which it was immediate. That was the age of Arnold Palmer. Everybody was kind of attracted to golf, and so I started playing golf, just driving range, which is better than just going out. So I got a couple of years of practicing before we built the first 9 holes of our golf course, and a couple of years later finished the second 9. So that was a place I spent a lot of time. Unlike just almost any of the other hotels in the Catskills, we kind of branched out, and that branching out started in 1960 when we bought Camp Anawana, which became Kutcher's Camp Anawana. It was an established sleepaway camp. And when that happened, so by 61, we were actually in action running it. I was a teenager at that point. And I opted to remain at the hotel. My 2 sisters and my cousin Bobby Kutcher and a whole bunch of other people wandered off to Camp Anawana, and they had a great time. I felt so comfortable being in the hotel doing what I was doing that I stayed, and I never regretted it, even though I knew the camp was a great experience. Because later on in life, I actually got to manage that in the second camp, which shows up later. But so my, as you're getting a little older, by the time I was 12 or 13, my parents allowed me to help out, because Sunday was a big day for checking in and checking out. And that was a crazy, crazy time, because you were checking. Our hotel had already gotten to the size where, 700-800 people could be, well, let's say 600 of them could be rolling in and 600 rolling out. So I would pitch in and try to help with bellhopping. I was not a big kid at the time. I waited a while before I kind of sprung up. So I was kind of skinny and not too tall. And we had a number of buildings that were 3-story buildings. Luckily, there were only 3 of them. But somehow, there was a little resentment. I didn't think about it till later on when I started to look back on my life. But the bellhops who had to were trying to make a living, the kids going to school and try to pay for themselves. And here's this skinny kid coming in, even though he was the child of the owners of the hotel, and possibly taking some tips away from them. So somehow I would get the most terrible rooms to bellhop to. People were coming for a week. There were big suitcases, and I'd get the 3rd floor of one of the buildings, whether it was the main building or the terrace building, and I had everything I could do to schlep some of those pieces of luggage up the stairs. And I remember, Marvin says about sometimes being abused sometimes. And here's this kid, working so hard, and people would tip decently. Every now and then I give you a quarter. And the thing, I go back and I tell my parents about it. And the first thing they said to me is, and this is something I told staff for many years after, he says, look, you're going to get good tips and you're going to get bad tips. You just smile and say, thank you. That's what you do in this business. You don't try to give it back and say, hey, you obviously need this more than I do, which some of our staff did over the years. And they didn't fare well with us when they would do something like that, because you don't do that in the hotel business. But that was my first working experience. And after that, I was around I was
Mark?
very knowledgeable about things.
Mark,
Yeah.
Mark, give us a couple of minutes on the other jobs, and then we're gonna go, and then we'll come back to you. Just mention
Okay.
some of the other
You
jobs
asked me
that
to
you
roll,
held,
start
and then we'll
rolling.
switch.
Okay,
It's okay. You're doing very well. Thank you.
thank you.
All right, so you want to take a pause?
No,
Patti,
so-
yours experience, oh, go ahead, Mark, go ahead.
okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to be quiet now.
Okay, Patti, and Mark, we'll get back to you for some of the things you did at later life. Patti, your experience was different than Sandy's or Mark's or mine, because you ended up in a part of the hotel that none of us actually directly, although Mark maybe somewhat, you ended up in the kitchen of all places. Tell us about, again, your family, just briefly, how your family got into the hotel business, what it was like growing up, and ultimately what job did you hold? Because that's an interesting story.
Okay.
Please.
And you may have to stop me also. So feel free. So when you first asked me to join in this panel, it makes me feel like so blessed to have been a part of the culture of the Catskills and to have been the boss's daughter of the Brickman Hotel, because it's been a privilege. And after all these years, it still resonates with so many people. And so that just blows me away. It brings me such joy. So I thank you. And I see some of my friends here and some of the men and women, men mostly, and my friend Rochelle, who worked in the dining room. I promise, Bart, I won't yell at you, I promise. So I'm the fourth generation of the Brickman family. My great-grandparents, Abraham and Molly, bought the Brickman property on May 10th, 1912. I have the deed downstairs. And they were recent immigrants. They had 4 children. They had 2 sons, Gil and Joseph, who had a laundry in Manhattan, and they had a son, Benjamin, who was at Cornell. And then they had a daughter, my grandmother, Anna. And so because she was single and female, she came to the country with her parents. At about that time, my grandfather immigrated to this country as well and was not happy in New York City. So he actually met a cousin of Abraham Brickman, and she said, I have a family up there, you could go, you'll be happy. And he did. He went to the farm. It was a farm and a boarding house. And he literally married the farmer's daughter. And that was my grandmother and grandfather. And so that's how I got to be here tonight. And so my grandparents and my great-grandparents were running the hotel, the 4 of them. My grandparents had 3 children. My Uncle Murray, who never had any children. My dad, who just had me. And they had a younger sister, Bibi, who has 2 children. But it was my dad and Ben who became owners of the hotel eventually. So about 1929, around the Depression, one of the brothers, Gil, needed to leave the city for financial reasons and came up to the country to be a part of the Brickman family again. And that was the demise of the Brickman family, not the Brickman Hotel. But by 1938, my grandparents, this is a long, convoluted story that's really tragic, but it's the breakup of the Brickman family. And my grandfather, Joseph Posner, and his wife, my grandmother, bought out all the siblings. And by then, Abraham and Molly were dead. And then the war came. So probably right around the time after the war, Murray and Ben, the sons, took over the hotel. And that's when our growth started. And then, so I was born, I came onto the scene in 1970. In 1950, I am 70, so you don't have to count. And
Okay.
and so it was, to grow up there was spectacular. I loved every minute of it, and so my first memories are not of a living room. It's not sitting in front of a fireplace, in front of a TV with mom and dad. My first memories are of a lobby with all of these strangers from a place called New York City in the Bronx and Queens. I had no idea what that was. And my memories are also not of a kitchen and my mother cooking dinner. My memories are of a kitchen that's the size of a warehouse The machine that washed the dishes was the size of an elephant. I mean, there were, I would sit at this pink flamingo table with my grandmother and a chef and a butcher and a candlestick maker, and we would eat meals together. And so my whole life has been populated by a myriad of people who, some of them were so bizarre that I remember thinking as a young kid, wow, people are really interesting. But I loved all of them. And so my first job was a camper in the day camp. And then I became a teenager. So I was in the teen program, and there I honed my flirting skills. And by the time I was 15, I was placed as a switchboard operator, which was a really fun job. I was really nosy, and I got to know a lot of stuff. And but the best thing about that job was there was a window that looked out onto the bellhop desk. So I got to look at all of these cute guys for like my whole shift. It was really fun. And so I spent a lot of time watching bellhops, and I actually married 2 of them, not at the same time, but I did meet them on the same day. I met them April 1st, 1965. And that in and of itself is a story which I am not going to share right now. So my next job was about when I was 16, they moved me up to the front desk where I learned my people skills. And then when I was about 17, they moved me to the other side of the desk, and now I would register all the guests. Remember, this is pre-computer, and we used pen and paper. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but when I was in 1st or 2nd grade and learning how to do cursive, my father spent a lot of time with me teaching me how to write very neatly. And he did that because he knew one day I'd be writing in this book. And he wanted, because that's what, as the supposedly heir apparent, they didn't envision me in the kitchen, they envisioned me at the front desk. And so I had a great handwriting, and I could do that job. When I was about 20, they put me into the reservation office, and I got to take reservations. And again, I had been primed for this. I didn't realize it. But my grandma, when I was a little girl, she would sit me down, and in her sweet little Yiddish accent would say, "Sweetheart, there's room 100. And I would say, "First floor, main building, facing the pool." And by the time I was 9 or 10, I knew where every single room was. I knew what direction. I mean, I had this whole place in my head. So when I sat down to take my first reservation, I had real experience, and it was a really fun job. Then when I was 26, I quit that job. I flew in anger I got into a fight with somebody who shall remain nameless, but some people on this call know who I'm talking about. And I had a summer off. It was great. I went to the pool. I had a drink in the afternoon. I had my own chaise lounge. It was fantastic. And at the end of the summer, my dad said to me, "Enough. You're going to be the steward of the kitchen." And I looked at him and I said, "I don't exactly know what a steward is." And he said, "You're going to run the kitchen." And I looked at him. I had absolutely no qualifications for this but one. I was the boss's daughter. And so my father, many of you knew him. He was a fantastic man. And he worked with me diligently until I learned not to yell at everybody, till I learned, and I don't think, and Ron can attest to this, that I ever got that down 100%. But he taught me how to manage. He taught me how to organize everything. But what he couldn't teach me was how to run a kitchen with 100 or 200 men and be the only female in charge. This was something I had to figure out on my own. And that was better than any college education anyone could ever do. But I had to learn to really come into my own power, to speak my mind. And most importantly, I had to learn how to curse, because you can't work with men unless you can really curse. And so I think I had a great job. I met people. I mean, it was one thing to meet all the guests, but that was not quite as interesting to me as meeting men from Alabama and Georgia and people who were homeless and people from Central and South America who were coming to this country to send money back to their families, you know. So the experience of, you know, this young, privileged little girl growing up in South Fallsburg, that I got to meet all of these people who were so diverse and so different from me, just expanded who I was. And you know, so I, you know, I loved it. And I'll stop now if you'd like.
Okay, that's terrific. Again, very different. Sandy Asman grew up at the Esther Manor. For those who don't know, the Esther Manor was the hotel close on 17B, closest to the racetrack, maybe a mile or so after it, and closest to Woodstock, which we may get into later. I mentioned that his mom and his aunt, Irene Asman and Esther Strasberg, owned and operated the hotels. And Sandy has some interesting stories that are different than ours. Sandy?
Hi. First of all, thank you, Marvin, for asking me to join you guys. As may have become obvious to anyone listening here, Marvin, Mark, and I all grew up together. We were classmates at Monticello High School. In fact, we were all on the tennis team where Mark saved me from going to Vietnam by allowing a ball to go past him on the left side when he was playing the net. I dove for it, dislocated my shoulder, and they didn't want me anymore. So thank you, Mark.
I remember the day.
Well, you remember the day?
I remember the day it happened. Yep.
Oh my God. I have my MHS 65 yearbook in the other room. I could bring it out and show you the pictures. But in any event,
Yep.
How did we get into the hotel business? My grandfather, Philip Goldstein, was among, if not one of, clearly the first Jewish settlers who moved from New York City up to the Catskills to have a farm, actually. And our hotel started actually as a farm, and it had a family building that was called the homestead, of all things. And we all kind of lived in the homestead. And I don't recall, obviously, back to when they started because I wasn't there. I was born in 47, post World War II, part of the baby boomers that include, obviously, Mark and Marvin. But in any event, when my grandfather, Philip, and grandmother Dora went up to the mountains, my grandfather was, and you know, we're talking about the Borscht Belt, so I don't think anybody who's paying attention to this at all or who has any recollection doesn't understand that this was a time when people were looking to leave the city because of various things, including the heat of the summer and other things that were health-wise, to go up to the Catskills for the cool evenings and such. And my grandfather started to have boarders come to the farm and stay at the farm. My grandfather, though, Philip, was an entrepreneur and respected his Jewish heritage, and he was a founding person with respect to the Landfield Avenue Synagogue, and also with what was called initially, I believe, the National Union Bank, which ultimately was acquired by Key Bank, et cetera. But in any event, at some point along the way, the boarding house aspect during the summer became more and more important, and as such, more and more was added to the old homestead in terms of converting from a farm. And I still remember the barn at the farm and the horse at the farm and all that other stuff at the farm. But at some point along the way, and I just was way too young to remember it all, the farm and boarding house started to evolve into a hotel. And in doing that, you have to remember, or I have to remember at least, that Philip and Dora Goldstein, who started the hotel, were the parents of 8 children. My mother, Irene, my aunt Esther, and 6 boys, Carl, Ben, Hi, Nat, Abe, and Ralph, 4 of whom were attorneys. A lot of you know my Uncle Carl and my Uncle Ben, who had a law office in Monticello, my Uncle Nat, who unfortunately died at an early age, a Harvard Law graduate, and my Uncle Hi were both attorneys and partners in New York City. My Uncle Abe and Uncle Ralph were not attorneys, but they were also entrepreneurs in the area. In any event, when the hotel started, because the 6 boys really had professions, it was left to the 2 girls, Esther and Irene, to run the hotel. And the hotel was like a lot of the other hotels, like the Delano or Kutcher's back in the early days, where it was a summer resort only. And there came a time in around April when we would move to the hotel. And after like Rosh Hashanah, in the end of September or so, we would all move back to Monticello. So Mark and Marvin and I and my sister Phyllis and my aunt's 2 daughters, Liba and Barbara, would all had homes in Monticello, as did Marvin and Mark. And that's where we all grew up. And it used to be funny, at least to me, growing up there, when people would come up and they would say, "Do you live here year round?" As though it was some kind of plague. I don't know if they did that to the others, but
Yes.
it was just weird. Now, I'm going to talk about some other things, but one of the things that really is important to me, because it's affected my life forever, from the time that I was probably about that big, I would be called over to the front desk to meet Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And say hello to my son or my nephew, Sandy. And I knew from that moment, I would never again need to know Mr. and Mrs. Smith's real name. And at that moment, the name went in here and out there, to the point that one of the skills that I learned at the hotel, and I don't know if this is true of Marvin or Patti or Mark, was to immediately forget somebody's name. And it has I have therefore gone through life hoping to somehow modify that. But what's funny was I was a decent student in school and spent the summer at Cornell right after my junior year of high school, and then went to MIT. And one of the things that my wife has observed about me is that if everybody had a number instead of a name, I'd remember them, because I'm very good with numbers. But in any event, going back to jobs in the hotel business, like others here, we all had to do something at the hotel. I mean, the hotel was the family business. We were there. We had to do something. So my first job, as I recall, was my first real job, notwithstanding what our summer, what do we call it, work permits or something, where so that we could be on the payroll. But in any event, my first real job probably was at 14, which was about as early as you could work in New York State at the time. And at that point, I'm trying to remember the name. I don't remember offhand. There was a family that ran a pool business, and I got called upon at 14 to be trained to operate all of the filters in our pool. We had an indoor pool and outdoor pool, and also because we were out past the racetrack, we didn't have any kind of municipal sewage system. we had our own sewer beds. What do they call them? Yeah, big sand and gravel beds that all the effluent was.
Leach fields.
What? It wasn't a leaching.
Leach fields.
You know what? I don't recall.
Yeah.
But all that water that went through there had to ultimately be chlorinated before it went into Kennybrook, because downstream from us was Camp Kennybrook, and therefore it was highly regulated. And I got called upon to handle the pools, the sewage treatment facility, et cetera, et cetera. Later on, at 16, I became a lifeguard and did that for a couple of years, but all the while always operating behind the front desk. And there came a time, I would say I was a senior in high school in 1965, when one of the guy named Eli Adato, I'll never forget Eli. Eli Adato worked in our coffee shop, and he was a scuba diver. And he saw me we had a very large outdoor pool. It had 500,000 gallons of water. And I used to wear a weight belt and a full face mask with oxygen or air pump. And I would go down into the water and clean the bottom of the pool during off hours. And Eli spotted me doing this one day, and he said, "Do you know how to scuba dive?" I said, "I don't even know what that means." He said, "Well, with scuba dive equipment, you don't have to be attached to this air hose and such." And he had extra stuff. And he taught me to scuba dive at a time when, other than me and Eli, the only other two scuba divers in the universe were Jacques Cousteau and Lloyd Bridges. So the four of us were the scuba divers of the 60s. Now, at the hotel, there were other things that after I guess I got my driver's license, I was called upon to do. Somebody always had to drive random errands into Monticello to go get ice from
Reynolds,
yes.
Reynolds
had the ice plant. You always needed extra ice aside from the monstrous ice machines that you had in the weekend. Somebody always had to go to the bus station to pick people up, and all of that stuff. Like Mark, I was also a bellhop at times. And the one thing that I was not permitted to do, probably because they were afraid Patti might come over to run the kitchen. I didn't know Patti before this whole thing set up. But one of the things I was never permitted to do was to work in the kitchen or the dining room. Those were always off limits to me. But I did handle lights in the nightclub, spotlights, backstage lighting, and things of that nature. Our hotel was, as I said, it started out as a farm that was between White Lake and Monticello. And as time went on, we acquired adjacent properties. There was a bungalow colony that we acquired. There was another property that became a day camp, and another property that we acquired. And I'd totally forgotten about this until I guess it was Mark that said something. There was a one-room schoolhouse. Yes, 1 minute.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm going to get. Okay. So what could I say? So
tell us about the most famous person that worked at the Esther Manor. Most of the people know, but let it not be unsaid who worked there, who's now world famous.
Other than me, of course.
Other than you.
Okay. As I said, the hotel was owned by my mom, Irene Asman. She had 2 children, me and my younger sister, Phyllis. And my aunt, Esther, who had 2 daughters, Liba and Barbara. Barbara's now a pediatrician in the Bronx. And Liba, as many of you know, against the wishes of my uncle Carl, who was an attorney, went ahead and married the piano player from our show band, somebody named Neil Sedaka. And Neil and Liba have now been married for 58 years. 58 years. Actually, I spoke to Liba today. She wanted to join this, which is odd because when I originally told her about it, she said, I don't want any part of it. I said, how about Barbara? She said, no way. But Phyllis, my younger sister, she said she'd be all over it. I don't know how Marvin's younger sister, Ellen, or Mark's younger sisters, Mady and Karen. And by the way, Karen was the ultimate, notwithstanding any of us, Karen was the ultimate child of the Catskills because she had not one, but twins on July 4th. Right, Mark?
Oh, yeah, that was quite an adventure.
And if there was any way,
I think Karen is on.
the family weekend for July 4th, it was to be, and she was where? Down in Philly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll interrupt you for a second.
Let's go
to
ahead.
add to that if you allow.
We all grew up together. You're allowed.
Backstage, it's July 4th. My parents had run down to Philadelphia. I'm running the hotel. They called to tell me about the twins. And I'm standing there next to Connie Francis, who's about to go on. And I say something to her about it. And she says, oh, my God. First thing she does when she walks out on stage, she takes a bow and she tells everybody about the twins. It was live around the room.
So if I could add my little story to that, I was born on May 27th, Friday night during dinner, Memorial Day weekend. And my daughter was born on Labor Day, 1977. So we have it all covered.
It's always Labor Day when they're born.
Yes.
This was Labor Day.
So let me do a brief background on my place, and then we'll take some questions.
What? That just shows how we really grow up together. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Marv.
To show how small world this is, my grandfather, Abe Schecht, was a barber in New York. And for those of you who don't know, the Winaric family made the powder, that white powder they used to put on the back of your neck when you were a kid and you got your hair cut, called Jerris. And he heard from the Barbers Union, you make more money in the Catskills in 10 weeks than you make being a barber 50 weeks a year. The first place he came up to rent, Sandy, you may not know this, Schecht's Cottages, right on the corner across from the Esther Manor. And he made more money in 10 weeks than he did in the barbershop. The next year, again, small world, Kinnybrook was a hotel in those days. He was a partner in the Kinnybrook Hotel. And my mom said that he and the guy that was the owner didn't speak to each other for the entire summer. And he swore he would never be a partner in the hotel business again. He went out and rented the Rose Glow on the Old Liberty Road, as it was called then, which became the Delano. The bottom of the stationery said, a friendly place for friendly people. It was a Hamisha, warm place, mostly families. My mom was in the office. My Aunt Yetta was in the office. My Aunt Anita was in the kids' dining room. My dad was in the bar. My Uncle Lou was the steward. My Uncle Max came up to help with the bar. My grandfather's sister was the hostess in the nightclub, etc. Aunt Clara handled all the chambermaids. All the family showed up. For those of you who don't know, you find out you have family that you never even heard of that would show up in the summer and say, I'm here, where's my room? And that's what we did. Just briefly, my own experience, like these folks, I was born in 47. And my earliest remembrance, not unlike Patti's, is being at the hotel. I had odd jobs over the years. My first job was running the Spotlight, like Sandy said. We started with a casino, not a casino for gambling. Casino is a large room with a bunch of folding chairs in it and a little stage. And every night they'd move the chairs to fit what was happening in the casino. So if it was dancing, you had a big space. If it was movies, you had all chairs, et cetera, et cetera. So I ran the Spotlight in the back of the room. And then when we had a nightclub, I did it again. When I got old enough to drive the tractor, which was my biggest thrill, the gardener got sick one summer and my grandfather said, you're going to be the gardener. And for $15 a week, I rode the tractor every single day. He said, what about trimming the trees and the bushes? And I said, no, I just do tractors. I wasn't interested in doing the rest of that. When I was 16, I became a busboy. When I was 17, I became a waiter. And again, being the grandson of the owner, most people got 3 tables, 24 people, 8 per table. As the owner's grandson, I got 4 tables. Just think what it's like to have 32 people all walk in exactly the same time, all wanting to be fed at the same time. Never mind being in a restaurant and not ever writing anything down. You had to remember everything. And as the motto went, if you didn't use your head, you used your feet. If you couldn't remember this for Mrs. Schwartz or that for Mrs. Whatever the name was, you went back in the kitchen and you started hustling. And that was the way I grew up. I like to say my people skills, if I have any, came from the hotel business. Much of what I did in later life, traveling around the globe for ADL, meeting people from all walks of life. But wherever I went, no matter where, if I mentioned the Catskills, I got an answer. So I'll leave you with this one. I sit down for lunch in a fundraiser for ADL in Detroit, and a man says to me, "Where are you from?" I said, "The Catskills." He said, "Have you ever played the Monster? Man, is that a great golf course?" And that was the way it was. One other story, I sit down at a luncheon in Las Vegas for a member of Congress whom I took to Israel on a trip. And a woman sits down next to me and she says, "Hi, where are you from?" I said, "New York." She said, "Where?" I said, "Upstate." She said, "Where?" I said, "The Catskills." She said, "Where?" I said, "Monticello." She said, "Fallsburg." And her family owned the Village Inn in Fallsburg. They moved to Vegas in the 50s, and she ended up becoming a congresswoman from the Las Vegas area. So wherever we go, and Judge Cook always used to tell the story, wherever he traveled in New York State, everybody knew the Catskills. For me, as I traveled around the globe and as I've traveled throughout the country, all you have to do is say the Catskills. And in part, that's because of Dirty Dancing. In part, that's because people know what the Catskills was like. And so I say, and I'm going to stop here and then ask if there are questions. I'm like that young kid who walked around in Dirty Dancing, whose uncle owned the hotel. We had the run of the place growing up. We went to camp. We didn't go to camp. We went to the kitchen, took the keys, went to the bakery, got a whole rack of cookies, and then sat outside and did what we want. We had a trampoline. When people went into the dining room, I'd get the keys and my cousins and I would go out on the trampoline for an hour. It was a lot of fun growing up, but you paid your dues. You worked hard. And frankly, for me and for my family, and again, my sister worked in the office, my cousins worked in the office, other cousins in the dining room. It was a great experience and I wouldn't trade it for the world. With that, I'll pause unless any one of you has something to add. Let's see if there are any questions. If you have a question, you can use your chat button, or if you want to raise your hand, I'll see if I can recognize you. The only thing you're going to have to do, Herbie Cohen, you're going to be my first one, but you got to unmute yourself.
Another
Herb
classmate from
also was a member of our class. Unmute, Herb.
I just sent him a request.
Okay,
I think
go
I
ahead.
got it.
Go ahead,
Am I
Herb.
unmuted?
Okay. Yep.
Yes. Marvin.
Yes.
Sandy, everyone's great seeing you. My question to you, Marvin, is there was a summer that I was playing drums in some bands, and there was a summer at the Delano where you folks hosted a lot of rock groups, the Dixie Cups and the Shirelles and stuff. And I was hired to play backup for part of summer in your hotel. Do you remember when that was?
Yes, it was 1967, I believe. And we had, for those who don't know, we had Gary U.S. Bonds and Little
Right.
Eva. We had the Isley Brothers. And this I did not learn until a couple of years ago. The guitar player for the Isley Brothers was Jimi Hendrix, who used the name Jimmy James at the time. And I looked it up in Google, and there it was, Jimmy James, 1967, backup guitarist for the Isley Brothers, amazingly so. And you're right, we had the Shirelles, we had the Chiffons, and as an aside, the bar made more money on that one night on Thursday than it made on the rest of the week combined, because we had room for almost, 900 people, and the
Packed.
place was absolutely packed. Yeah, thanks, Herb. Any other questions? Alan Sperber, did you have your hand up? Unmute, Alan.
I am on mute. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
I'm
Yes.
on mute. Okay. I was fortunate enough. Well, I'm a little older than you guys. I was born in 1941, but I was fortunate enough to study music, and I worked in bands for 4 summers in the Catskills. The summer of '62 and '63, I was in a show band at the Laurels on Sackett Lake, and we would have a late show that would start at like 1:30 in the morning and end up at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. We wouldn't be able to have a rehearsal for most of the acts, but we were in the coffee shop for an hour, and anybody who wanted to talk over their show, they could do that. But most of the time, we had to sight read the full late show.
May I?
But what I remember,
Sandy,
one point I have to mention, many of the acts we got in the late show, because the Laurels was different than most hotels. It was a very young, swinging crowd. And we got acts that had played the other hotels that Saturday night that came to the Laurels to try their acts out on a younger crowd. So the late show was unbelievable every Saturday night. You have a question?
Yeah.
let me, Sandy, hold on one sec.
Go ahead.
Alan,
Yeah.
I was at the show that Jackie Wilson did, the late show. Jackie Wilson came on at 1 o'clock and brought the house down for at least 2 hours. It went on till the wee hours of the morning. All I can tell you is we got back to the Delano in time for the milkman to deliver the milk on the outside the porch of the kitchen. And we ran upstairs to get dressed before my grandfather caught us. By the way, Herbie Cohn, who just spoke, ran the boats on the lake at the Laurels with Richie Bergman. So we all know that.
Herbie,
Sandy, do you need to add something? Sandy?
Yeah, I was going to say Herbie and Richie Bergman, both of whom are now attorneys in Miami area, ran the boat concession at the Laurels.
The Laurels.
Yes.
So that lake was beautiful.
Other questions?
Again, was one of our classmates.
I think of all the hotels, the Laurels had about one of the greatest properties because it had this huge lake and a big lawn that went from the main house to the lake. It was just a gorgeous place. I had great 2 summers there. It was just fantastic.
Any other questions? Raise your hand, please. Or if
Marvin,
you're on a phone, just, yes.
we have one in the
Jonathan?
chat that's from Howard Katz. And
Okay.
it says, we used to come from Cleveland every summer to stay at the Brickman. My father, Max, became friends with Murray Posner. Thanks, Patti and her family, for the many good memories. My question is, roughly how many guests at the various hotels were not from New York?
Oh, gosh.
Well, I'll answer from my vantage point. The answer is very few. I think Kutcher's had, you could speak to this, Mark, had more from like Philadelphia and from Pennsylvania. But I think 95, maybe even higher percentage of the guests at the Delano were from Queens, Bronx, Brooklyn, some Staten Island, very few, some suburbs, but mostly the boroughs. Because remember, this is before air conditioning. And my grandfather used to say the best thing that can happen to us is it's 100 degrees on July 4th in the city. We'll have a very good summer because everybody came out of the city. The heat was unbearable. And, it's 2 hours. In the early days, it was 9 hours. But in the 60s, it was a 2-hour ride. Do you all remember the hacks? They called them those long, elongated Cadillacs with people. And it was almost like the clown thing at the circus. The hack would stop, the doors would open, and 27 people would get out, all of whom had their luggage on the roof, tied on with string and cords. And there were no bungee cords in those days. Mark, or Sandy or Patti, did you have any larger percentage from elsewhere?
During, you want to go, Mark?
You can go first. Ladies first.
I'm speaking. Couldn't resist. So during the 60s and those years, we had mostly exclusively people from New York City. But then when we started to be open from Passover to Election Day, we had to fill in the blanks on the midweeks. And so we filled them in with senior citizen groups who were not from New York City. They were mostly not Jewish, and they were mostly from anywhere from like an hour or two outside of the region, say from Philadelphia maybe to Boston. I know that's going a little farther. So we filled in a lot of gaps in the years, like the last 20 years that we had it, with people who were not Jewish, to fill in the so that, because we couldn't make a living just having people on weekends. And the weekend groups were predominantly Jewish, except for the 5 polka weekends, where we made more money in the bar than ever before.
Yeah, we advertised actively in Philadelphia and Boston, in Washington, D.C., and in Canada. And we did get a fair number of guests over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in 1964, we became year-round. And it changed the whole metric of what we were doing. And we had to stay busy for a lot of the time, and really had to push the envelope as to what kind of a hotel we were going to be.
Sandy, do you want to answer that too, or are you okay?
Yeah, actually, as I recall, first of all, I didn't know anybody's names. I made that clear earlier. So I certainly didn't care where they came from. But as I recall, pretty much everybody was from the New York City area, although there were New Jersey people as well. I don't recall a whole lot from Pennsylvania or Vermont, or, elsewhere in the Northeast.
Mark,
we had
Mark, your hotel became famous. Mark, yeah, thank you, Sandy. Mark, your hotel became famous for sports. Why don't you tell us how it ended up that there was a professional basketball game at the hotel, which drew virtually from not only the Catskills, but from all over?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, that was the Maurice Stokes game. Maurice Stokes was a terrific player in the NBA, whose career was cut short quite early, where he got from falling and hitting his head, he got a form of encephalitis. He was totally paralyzed. And Jack Twyman, he was with Cincinnati Royals. Jack Twyman, who was his teammate, really was the only one who, the NBA was simple then. It was not where it is today. And they didn't have the wherewithal. They didn't have pensions. And he needed to be supported. And Jack and my father met. My father was very involved in basketball. Red Auerbach worked for us for many years as our athletic director, and we were surrounded by other people in the sports. And he and Jack got together, and my father said, if you can supply the ball players, I will do everything else. There will be no cost for anything. And that game started in 1959 with Will Chamberlain jumping against Bill Russell, and it lasted for over 40 years. During the 12 years Maurice was alive, we raised all the money he needed for all his therapy back in Cincinnati. And the moments where he could show up at that game were really amazing. All of the players, and he was so upbeat that even though he went through such terrible stuff, if you were around him, he could make you feel better. It was very special for me growing up, and eventually running that game. And then we kept running a golf tournament, and we created a lot of good things for a lot of people out of that. And one of the things I'm really most proud of that we did as a family.
Mark, I know you're also very friendly with Wilt. How did Wilt end up as a bellhop? That famous picture of Wilt handing the luggage to the guy on the first floor of the main building is iconic. How did Wilt end up there? Yeah.
Wilt came to the hotel. We had a basketball team. And of course, like I said, Red Auerbach was the coach of our basketball team. He was, at the same time he was the coach of our basketball team, he was the coach of the Boston Celtics. And so, under his tutelage, they were the best team in the NBA or in sports total. I mean, they were amazing. And Wilt came to us to play and work as a teenager. He was still at Overbrook High School in Philadelphia. In his junior year and senior year at Overbrook, he worked at the hotel. And he became a lifelong friend of my parents and the rest of my family. Me, I considered him an older brother. I loved him. He was a wonderful man. And so we were together since that point till the day he died. He was at the hotel supporting us in the Stokes game a month before he passed away. But yeah, we had a lot of friends, but then no one like him.
Okay, I understand from our tech assistant, Jonathan, that Donald Barak and Shelley Strickland have questions. Could Don unmute and please ask you? I can't find you on my screen, Don, but if you're out there, why don't you unmute and go ahead.
You got me, I'm unmuted.
Go ahead.
First of all,
Okay.
My grandparents had a hotel up there also. It was called the Excelsior. I don't know if you know it or knew it. It closed in 1947, the year I was born. But I have a question. And the question is,
Go ahead.
My friend Lois tells me that many of the comedians started up there as tumblers. And all of you folks have been talking about the famous rock and roll singers. So do you remember the comedians also and who they were?
Well,
I can answer that to start with. Let me just toss one out. How many? I assume most of us on the phone on the line here have heard of Mal Z. Lawrence. He was known as Mal Lawrence in 1957. And he was a tumbler at the Delano for the entire summer. What's a tumbler? Simon Says in the morning, calisthenics, volleyball, pool exercises, dance classes in the afternoon, MC the show, be the comedian on Friday night, introduce all the singers, be the host. That's what a tumbler does. And then in the dining room, walk around and kibitz everybody while they're eating. And if you know Mal Z, he didn't have the Z in those days. If you know Mal Lawrence, you know he's just got this bubbly or personality, and he was exceptional. We had one other person that hosted at the Delano. I don't know if you'd call him a tumbler. You heard of Fivish Finkel?
Oh, yeah.
He was on, what's that, Picket Fences? He was a cantorial singer and very learned in Jewish tradition. And he was at the Delano in, I think, 1954. And again, sang, carried on, had the talent show, spoke to the people at the hotel. And they did this all in exchange primarily for room and board. By the way, none of us mentioned, I got $18.38 every 2 weeks for being a waiter in the dining room. And they took off for room and board. I won't tell you the caliber of the rooms that at the hotels, what the staff had, but it was nothing you want to write home about. Did somebody else, Mark or Patti or Sandy, want to talk about tumblers?
Mal also spent several summers at our hotel, as did Jackie Mason back in the way back days. And there were others, they moved from place to place over the summer as they found other opportunities.
Patti, one second, Patti.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Ready?
Go ahead.
Well, so two stories. I'll tell one little one about Jackie Mason. He was doing a show at the hotel, and the hotel was booked, and they needed to find a room for him. And so they shoved me out of my bed and plopped Jackie Mason into my bed. So I always like to say Jackie Mason slept in my bed. But I'd also like to introduce.
Yeah, we know about the bellhop studio.
the Tumblr, I never pronounce it right, from the Brickman Hotel that I also met on April 1st, 1965, is here in the audience. And he's the best. Mark will agree with me. I know that 100%. So I would like to introduce Larry Strickler because he is the epitome of what we're talking about. And he worked for us until we
Larry, where are you?
Raise your hand, Larry.
Larry, where are you?
He's in car 54.
Oh, you can do more than that. You can do more than that, Larry. Where are you? Oh, Larry, unmute your. I want to say something about you, Larry.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you. I want to say something about you. You can hear that I'm pretty good at telling stories about the Catskills having grown here. I watched you tell your spiel last year, I think it was, at the staff meeting where they had at the Villa Roma, of all places, Villa Roma, which is, right? Am I right?
Yes, you're right.
Did you speak at Villa Roma?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so I want to say Villa Roma is not one of the kosher hotels. It's a different clientele. It's a wonderful place. And there were, I don't know, several hundred people there. And I came up just to see you because I wanted to compare my stories to yours. And I must tell you, you were fabulous. There was not a word out of place. You had great stories. Your experiences in those hotels is terrific. Now, if you want to say something, go ahead.
And he learned it all at the Brickman. I'm only kidding.
I don't think Mark agrees with you.
You started with us.
Anyway, I would like to say, even though food supposedly was the most important thing that was offered to guests, it was really the activities. And being a director of activities was a wonderful thing for me. It really was. And I worked for these two wonderful people, you know, for the Kutchers and the Brickman, the Posner family. And it was special. And I was going to ask them, as if I wasn't, you know, an unknown person, how important were activities to the guests, Patti and Mark? And, you know, did you like your director of activities? How good were they? And of course, I wouldn't mention my name, so none of your people knew that I was really.
The thing that I like best about our director of activities are his children.
That was the best thing that I had. Was
well, Larry,
I was very
you have a standing invitation to join us. You have a standing invitation, Larry, to join us on one of these Tales from the Borscht Belt when we do it going forward. Please send your email address to marvinrappaport@gmail.com. And I'll be sure to include you on one of our upcoming sessions.
Yeah,
Other questions?
Larry has a marvelous, this is his wife, Shelley, who always butts in, right, Patti and Mark? Larry has, as we heard before, this absolutely marvelous lecture that he does. It's an hour long. It's filled with slides, videos. They're all our photos and photos that Patti graciously gave us and Mark gave us some too. And I think he would love to do something like that. Yeah.
But anyway, I want to say publicly how much I enjoyed working for the Posner family, that's the Brickman Hotel, and the Kutcher family. They were wonderful people. Not only were they great business people, but they really were warm, tender, good-natured people. And I was very lucky, and so was my family. So thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Sure. Other questions? By the way, Sandy?
Yeah, if I could say a couple of things. You know, we all had our separate hotels. We all had our separate businesses. And in some sense, we were all competitors. But there was always a close-knit family among all of us. You know, I didn't know a lot of Marvin's family. I knew his dad, of course. I didn't really know his grandparents. Mark and I basically grew up. Helen was the queen of the Catskills. We, you know,
here.
When we lost her, we lost the end of the females who ran hotels, essentially. And, you know, it was a crazy time. It was a time when other things were going on in the world that back in the 60s, and yet it, you know, as I said earlier, there were the people who came up, the kids who came up, you live here year round kind of people. But yeah, we did And I'd like to believe that we all have that heritage and we all kept those friends forever. And, Patti, welcome to the group. I didn't know you before, but then again, we had Monticello, South Fallsburg, Liberty, and a few other, Ellenville, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, what you say is so true, because some of my Fallsburg buddies are here, and then several members of our staff are here. And like Bart Charlo is here, and they own the Irvington Hotel. And Bart's family, they're my family.
Yeah, we all grew up together. We all shared the same experiences.
Yeah, and Bart and I and his siblings are still friends.
Yeah, and we stayed friends over the many, 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 many years. And so I appreciate that you've invited me to join this group. It was a time that just will never be repeated.
No.
Yes.
It was-
Any other
the
questions
Catskills
before
were
we
quite
wind down?
unique and special.
Bart, did you want to say something, Bart?
Bart-
Charlo?
Yeah,
Wait, Sandy. Wait 1 second. Let's let Bart talk.
All of you know was an extraordinary place. Same stories as you guys. We all did everything, except I will admit to the fact that though I did everything in the hotel except one thing, my sisters made the beds. I never made the beds.
I never did
One of
that.
my sisters is on the line, and she can vouch for that. But what I wanted to tell you was this about growing up there, and we all loved it. And we all had just an incredible experience that framed our lives that no one else will ever have again. But the thing that I was left with is my father passed away at the beginning of July 4th weekend, 1970. I had just graduated from college. I had my first job in another state. So I flew back, for the funeral and all that. And the guests are piling on me in the office because my father was the last of the boys in the hotel family. And they all were worried about whether they were going to get what they wanted for the summer. And my mother looks at me and she says, well, you're the next generation. Do you want it? And I looked at her and I said, Mom, you told me all my life the hotel was killing my father. There's the proof. Sell it.
Wait, I got to say this. Bart, what you just said reminded me of what Liba said when I invited Liba Sadaka to join us this evening, and she said she was unable to do so. And the reason that she gave for being unable to do so was that she was going to be too busy making beds in the lower level of the Fildora, being named after one of the buildings named after my grandfather Philip and my grandmother Dora. So now you know where Liba is.
And just for the record, I never made a bed. Never. And then after the Irvington was sold, Bart's mom came to work for us for years, Harriet, and she was like a second mom to me. So it's
So I wanted to make sure
Any other questions?
guys didn't take it all the credit, because Fallsburg, was the center of it all.
absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
There was enough to go around, fortunately, but you're right. There was that, Sandy, you're right about the camaraderie on the part of the hotel owners, as well as a healthy competition. Every time you drove past the other hotel, you checked out how many cars were in the lot, and you did your calculations. And, but it was both friendly and competitive. And yet the fact that there were so many, it's like antiques. People tell me that the more antique shops you have on the street, the better it is, because people come to where the antiques are. And likewise here, what do we have? 500 hotels at one time active in the mountains, and 50 some odd thousands or 500,000 people in the summer. It was a crazy heck. I'll close with this. We have one more question in the chat room. I'll recognize Jonathan. Thank you. I used to say there's something insane about working your butt off for 10 weeks, literally, no days off, no meals off when you're in the dining room. And for the people like my parents and grandparents, there was no time off. If you're lucky, you got time to take a nap in the afternoon if somebody would spell you at your job. And then inevitably they would call you and wake you up. like my dad or my uncle, because some crisis arose. But it was also an insane thing to do that. And then most of us had to live for the rest of the year on the earnings that we made from the summer. Because while many of our parents and family members had other jobs, it didn't compare. There was nothing we could do that would, bring in the kind of revenue that we had by being at the hotel for the summer. So I see Lynn Skolnick, she was on last time we did this panel and talked about putting herself through college just by the, several $1,000s a year, a summer that she made in the dining room, as most of us did. We, our educations were built on the backs of working in the hotels, and it was very special. Jonathan, who asked the question on chat?
So in the chat, we have a question from Joe W. And what we have is the mention of bands playing reminds me that in about 68, 69, when I was in high school, we'd go to one of the hotels or possibly the bungalow colonies, and in a casino type small building, we saw many bands that were either then or soon to be famous. 10 years after Mountain, Jethro Tull. I cannot remember where that took place.
It was at Breezy Corners.
That was
one place.
Breezy Corners.
I saw Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Time out. Time. Breezy Corners was a bungalow colony down toward the ski hill.
By the Concord.
Not far from the Concords. And it was actually owned by the English family, which was my Uncle Ben's wife's sister. So
It's very incestuous, the Catskills.
No.
What?
You know what Breezy Corners is now? You know where Breezy Corners is now? It's the corner of the building that comprises the casino right here in Monticello. It's built on the property that was Breezy Corners, for those of you who don't know.
Yeah.
I saw Blood, Sweat, and Tears at Gibbers.
My grandmother owned
and I saw the Times.
a colony in Monticello called the Carroll House. I have no
Carroll House,
clue
yep.
who Carroll was, but it was the Carroll House.
Oh, yeah.
Any other questions? If not, we're going to say good night and thank you. We appreciate everybody. Blood, Sweat, and Tears was at Gibbers. And the original trumpet player for Blood, Sweat, and Tears was a guy named Jerry Katz, who was the trumpet player at the Delano. He's on the first album. So if we don't have any further questions, I just want to thank everybody, our guests, Sandy Asman, Patti Posner, Mark Kutcher, Jonathan Sanger at the library for putting it all together. We appreciate your interest. We will have tomorrow on YouTube a link that you can share with your friends, neighbors, and family, and they can watch at their leisure. And we hope you'll do that. And stay tuned. We'll have another one of these before too long, I hope.
Yeah,
Thanks, and everybody should be safe and should be well.
And if
Thank
anyone
you to my
wants to,
friends who are here.
anyone wants to friend me on Facebook, I'm Sandy at asman.com. I'm there.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alan, Lenny.
Take care,
Good night.
everybody.
Good night, Marvin, Patti, Mark.
Family, Bob, Amy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
No problem. Thank you.
Mm.